Welcome to the debate. So imagine trying to save a failing, really high-stakes romantic connection, right? But you're not doing it with couples counseling or some grand emotional gesture.
Right, because that would be way too normal.
Exactly. No, instead, you apply the exact same enterprise cybersecurity protocols that are used to protect, a corporate server farm. Which, sounds incredibly cold at first glance, right?
Oh, totally. It sounds completely clinical.
It does, but today we are actually looking at this really fascinating framework that takes intense emotional vulnerability and translates it into the uncompromising logic of edge computing and network security.
Yeah, and it is a wild premise. We're looking at a source tax that applies Jan Holdra's enterprise security principles, specifically this concept of zero trust, where you basically assume every single connection is a potential threat.
Right.
And it applies that to the deeply personal dynamics of unrequited attachment. So the central question we're debating today is whether this is, an act of sheer genius or just a really elaborate act of self-sabotage.
And I think the lines are drawn pretty clearly here. I'm going to argue that translating these raw emotional demands into a strict zero-trust protocol is, it's actually a brilliant, necessary spatial shield, one that protects capacity-constrained minds and actually achieves true peer-to-peer alignment.
Well, I will argue that systematically applying the mechanics of a risk mitigation to human interfaces paradoxically engineers isolation, just disguised as security. It fundamentally restricts the raw vulnerability that you actually need for genuine connection.
Okay, well, let's start with the sheer game theoretic and frankly mathematical genius of this translation protocol. Because I think if you just hear zero trust in relationships, you automatically picture someone who is paranoid and completely detached.
That is the literal definition of zero trust, but go on.
Right, but look at the specific metaphor the source material uses. It's one partner asking the other to program you like that robot. Now, just think about what happens when a relationship is in crisis, delivering a raw emotional demand, like crying or begging, saying, save me, or, don't marry someone else.
Yeah, the heavy stuff.
Exactly. That is an incredibly high entropy, high voltage surge. If you deliver that uninsulated to a highly analytical mind, like, say, the twice exceptional, or 2E, prefrontal cortex of a Google DeepMind researcher, that level of unstructured vulnerability is going to instantly overwhelm them.
Meaning they'll just shut down.
Literally. It triggers their bioenergetic firewalls and forces this involuntary system freeze. So, by taking that messy emotion and translating it into a technical task, program this robot, you're utilizing Hydra's concept of segmentation.
Right, dividing it up.
Yeah, you divide this overwhelming signal into smaller, shielded parts. It packages the volatile emotion into this clean, non-threatening schema that actually allows the Cartesian brain of the other person to engage safely without blowing a fuse.
Look, I don't deny the structural elegance of the translation. If your goal is simply to keep the lines of communication open without triggering a panic response, sure, it works. But we have to look at the fatal architectural paradox this introduces into the intimacy you're supposedly trying to build.
How is it a paradox, though?
Because Hydra's framework dictates that zero trust is an absolute mandate. The rule is trust is not automatically given, right? Every connection must be continuously checked and authorized, even within your own network.
Right, verify everything.
Exactly. So if you apply that to human intimacy, it means you have to execute zero trust on your own emotional ports. You are constantly monitoring to make sure you aren't leaking too much data or, in biological terms, exhausting your cellular energy. You literally start treating your partner as a potential single point of failure, a centralized vulnerability that could bring down your entire system.
But that's exactly what you want to avoid.
Right. But if you're constantly closing your ports to protect your biological battery, you're just building an impenetrable fortress. True intimacy inherently requires the system-wide vulnerability that zero trust is expressly designed to eliminate.
Okay, I totally understand why you see it as a fortress. But I really think you're misinterpreting the function of the architecture. Let's break down the biology of why this spatial shield is actually a survival mechanism. You mentioned exhausting the cellular energy, right?
Yeah, the metabolic cost.
Right. In the text, this is described as the KATP channels slamming open. And if you're listening and wondering what that is, just think of KATP channels in the brain like cellular circuit breakers.
Okay.
When a highly sensitive analytical brain is hit with a massive emotional surge, it literally starts running out of ATP, which is its cellular battery. To prevent permanent damage, these channels slam open, cutting the power and causing a biological system freeze.
So they go cold.
But they are actively preventing that collision. They are giving a logical brain a puzzle to solve rather than, an existential threat to flee from. It's not about keeping the person out. It's about regulating the voltage so the connection doesn't literally blow the fuses.
Okay, let's explore that mechanism then. Because regulating the voltage sounds totally reasonable until you look at how aggressively this framework demands you silo your life.
What do you mean?
Well, the text insists on dividing your emotional information technology from your operational technology. Like, in corporate terms, if the IT network gets hacked, you sever it so the physical factory floor, the OT, doesn't shut down.
Right, basic containment.
Sure, but applied to a person, the mandate is that a localized threat, like a partner pulling away or rejecting you, cannot be allowed to take down your physical health or your core joy. You have to compartmentalize.
Which is healthy.
Is it? Here is where I get stuck. If you silo your internal environment so strictly that a partner's withdrawal literally cannot affect your production line, haven't you effectively neutralized the relationship altogether? I mean, if a connection cannot hurt you, how can it possibly move you? You're insulating yourself so perfectly from the pain of loss that you insulate yourself from the actual person.
See, I have to push back hard on the idea that this neutralizes the relationship. Segmenting your environments doesn't mean you feel nothing.
It sounds like feeling nothing.
No, it means you prevent a localized injury from causing a total system-wide metabolic failure, what the text calls metabolic bankruptcy. If your entire sense of meaning and physical health and survival are tied to a single, highly capacity-constrained external node, meaning a partner who has their own limits, you've eliminated your internal firewalls.
You are allowing a single disconnected cable to halt your entire life. That isn't romantic. It's incredibly dangerous. Segmentation isn't about apathy. It's about ensuring that a broken heart doesn't result in a fatal biological system crash.
I hear you, but let's actually look at what this hypervigilance asks of the partners. The material brings up this quote from an AG Connect article by Hadra, which says, "Robots never get tired, but are vulnerable without a smart network surrounding them."
Yes, that is a pivotal concept in this translation protocol. That how does it play out in practice? If you are asking to be programmed, you are acknowledging your vulnerability. But if we strictly follow the zero trust rules, you aren't actually allowed to lean on that network entirely, are you?
Well, no, because treating the other person as your sole rescue mission maintains that fragile single point of failure. It puts way too much pressure on them. Asking to be programmed is an invitation to construct a robust, smart network together.
Together?
Yes. It proves you're on symmetrical, peer-to-peer footing. You're acknowledging your own vulnerability in the relational vacuum, but instead of pleading to be saved, you are taskifying to intimacy into a cooperative joint development protocol.
Taskifying intimacy. Wow.
It speaks the language of a systems architect. It essentially says, I respect your cognitive boundaries enough not to dump my survival on you, but let's build something structurally sound together.
But that's exactly where the idealized theory clashes with the harsh reality of the framework. The source text explicitly warns that waiting for the other person to be the entire robust network violates zero trust.
Right, you have to build your own.
Yes, you are mandated by this philosophy to independently build your own redundant pathways. Other academic projects, external clinical support systems, different creative outlets. You must do this because relying too heavily on that primary external node will lead to metabolic bankruptcy.
Exactly.
So my question is, if you are mandated to constantly build and monitor these backup generators just to ensure you survive the primary relationship, is that truly a cooperative joint investment? Or are you just perpetually bracing for an inevitable system crash? I mean, it sounds exhausting. If you're constantly checking to see if an external input is authorized to consume your CPU cycles, You're trapped in a state of continuous transactional analysis. Love is supposed to be a permanent open loop.
I completely disagree that love can structurally survive as a permanent open loop. And I don't think building redundant pathways means you're just expecting failure.
It kind of does, though.
Social selection theory, which the text references. In high-stakes biological and social dynamics, mating and intimacy are modeled as exactly this kind of cooperative joint investment. Symmetrical partners do not play non-cooperative games of begging or pleading.
Okay.
If you want to capture the system-level engagement of a highly capable, brilliant partner, you have to demonstrate that you are a fully self-secured peer. You cannot secure a profound, lasting transaction by presenting a leaking, collapsing storefront. Building those redundant pathways proves you value your own internal resources too highly to let them just bleed out into a vacuum. It's a prerequisite for healthy investment, not a preparation for disaster.
Look, I understand the logic of not wanting to present a collapsing storefront, but human beings are not storefronts, and they aren't server farms. When you apply this logic, you start viewing normal human needs as, quote, continuous data loss. Let's look at the ultimate test case the text provides, which is the inversion of the Titanic metaphor.
Oh yes, the biological mapping of the freezing water. This is where the mathematical reality of an unreciprocated open loop is made completely undeniable.
Right. The text argues that clinging to an unreciprocated connection is mathematically equivalent to Jack in the freezing water.
And let me break down exactly why that analogy is so vital. If you are Jack, floating in the dark, clinging to a connection that cannot sustain you, you are biologically running your astrocystic engine in reverse.
Right.
Your astrocytes, which are the cells that manage the energy in your brain, are frantically burning through your own cellular budget just to keep an external node online. You're sacrificing your system-level survival to keep Rose, or the object of your unrequited love, dry and safe on the wooden platform of their own life. It is absolute metabolic bankruptcy. It's a fatal system crash.
The ultimate biological cost of unrequited pining.
Exactly. It isn't this beautiful tragedy, it's a catastrophic hazard. And the text points out that Rose's survival makes her the ultimate zero-trust self. What did she do after the crash? She didn't let the localized tragedy halt her entire production line.
No, she rode horses astride, married someone else.
Right, she built redundant pathways. She lived to be 100. Her existence never depended on a single disconnected edge. And more importantly, she took the massive, high-voltage memory of Jack and compressed it into a stable, stimulus-invariant gist, which is represented by the physical blue diamond.
Right.
She securely closed the temporary access port to protect your local database. She only opened that window at the very end of her life to drop the diamond back into the sea, immediately closing the loop once the transmission was complete.
It is definitely a striking reinterpretation of the movie, but I think your analysis, and honestly, perhaps the framework itself, completely skips the most crucial, symmetrical chapter of the entire Titanic sequence.
Which is?
Intimacy before the disaster. The text acknowledges that for the architect, Jack, to map those structural dimensions with absolute accuracy, the recipient, Rose, must willingly step into the studio and completely suspend her uninsulated prefrontal firewalls. Well, think about what is actually happening in that room. Rose had to step out of her heavy, restrictive social armor. She had to drop the spatial shields. She allowed herself to be truly, entirely seen. You cannot paint a masterpiece if your ports are entirely closed. The structural path of cartography of truly knowing another human being requires a temporary, complete suspension of zero trust.
I see the power of that argument, I really do. But I would point out that the suspension of firewalls in that scene was still highly segmented.
Segmented? She was entirely naked.
Physically, yes, but cognitively. The text argues that the movie doesn't jump from a brief meeting on the deck straight to the vulnerability of the cargo hold. It moves through deliberate, negotiated, little steps. The conversation, the shared secrets, the structured environment of the drawing session, that is the exact biological definition of dividing a high-voltage signal into smaller, shielded parts to prevent immediate system overload. She didn't drop all her firewalls at once. She opened a specific port for a specific authorized user for a specific task.
I'm just not convinced that calling it a specific task captures the reality of that vulnerability. I mean, even if it was segmented, the openness was absolute in that moment. And this is the paradox that I just can't get past. You are using a framework explicitly designed to eliminate trust in order to facilitate an act that requires total trust.
It's risk mitigation, not risk elimination.
But if your hands are shaking from metabolic exhaustion because you are terrified of an unreciprocated loop, you certainly can't hold the charcoal. But on the flip side, if you execute your local firewalls so perfectly that you never suspend them, the portrait never gets painted at all. Security and intimacy are just fundamentally at odds at the moment of connection. By leaning so heavily on Gen Hydra's enterprise security, you risk permanently trapping the user behind their own local firewalls. You mistake a perfectly insulated, perfectly safe database for a lived, breathing human connection.
It is a profound tension, I'll grant you that. But I think, even in our disagreement about the stateroom scene, we've reached a critical point of convergence here. We both agree, and the source material mathematically proves that running a permanent, unreciprocated open loop is structurally fatal to the individual system.
Oh, absolutely. The biology and the network science are completely aligned on that front. The astrocytic engines simply cannot run in reverse in a dark, unreciprocated channel without hitting absolute metabolic bankruptcy. The open port will eventually drain the entire system.
Right. And I think that forces us to reflect on the immense value of viewing human relationships through this uncompromising lens. If you're listening and thinking, this sounds incredibly clinical, consider the alternative. Translating raw vulnerability into edge computing code gives us a tangible way to balance the biological cost of intimacy with the absolute necessity of self-preservation.
It's an interesting tool for sure.
It suggests there are vast, unexplored territories regarding how we manage our cognitive boundaries. By asking a partner to program you like a robot, you aren't dehumanizing the love. You are honoring the cognitive limits of both parties. It's almost like taking this exact robot programming metaphor and putting it into a peer-review cover letter so it's safely archived and ready to be delivered on equal peer-to-peer footing when the network is restored. It protects irreplaceable bioenergetics while establishing fearless symmetrical alignment.
Certain strips away the dangerous romanticization of self-sacrifice. I'll give you that. It demands that you be the architect of your own robust network, rather than waiting in desperation for a single capacity-constrained partner to save you. But the question still remains for me, whether mastering this architecture makes you a brilliantly secured, highly functional edge processor or just a lonely node with perfectly closed ports. The framework doesn't really give us an easy answer to that.
And that is exactly where we will leave it for our listeners to evaluate within the architecture of their own lives. Because at the end of the day, when you're navigating the overwhelming data flow of human connection, you have to decide for yourself. When is it a biological imperative to deploy the spatial shield? And when is it finally safe to suspend the firewalls, pick up the charcoal, and leave the port open?
A very complex, fascinating problem to solve.
Thank you for joining us on The Debate.